Hi everyone, and welcome back for some more eclectic reading. Today, what I'm going to do is give some brief impressions of Colson Whitehead's most famous book, The Underground Railroad, an Oprah's book club pick published in 2016, and one that's twice as popular on Goodreads as his second most popular book, The Nickel Boys, and 10 times more popular than his third most popular book, Zone 1, which is, I think, about zombies. So yeah, he covers a pretty wide variety of topics in his writing. The Nickel Boys was actually the first of Whitehead's books that I read, and I thought it was fine. I mean, I liked it, but it didn't really stand out to me a ton or really stick with me. It was a little shorter than I might have preferred to, although I think some reviewers would disagree with me on that. But generally, I prefer concision over long and drawn out stories, but I just kind of felt like something was still missing from that one. I don't know. Not enough that I would discourage anyone from reading it if they are interested. Anyway, Whitehead's overall writing style is rich and thoroughly interesting to read, using pretty interesting language and literary devices, but ones that aren't so complex or sophisticated sounding as to scare away a more general audience of readers. Like in The Nickel Boys, I did find the writing one of the strongest aspects of the book, and something that really immersed me throughout, even when other aspects of the book were a little bit more questionable. And just to really underscore that point, despite my not totally loving The Underground Railroad or The Nickel Boys, I still feel like I'll probably pick up his newest book, The Harlem Shuffle, at some point. I've actually even heard some reviews that said it was so-so and not to expect anything utterly amazing from it, but I just have to admit Whitehead is pretty fun for me to read, and it still appeals to me even if I won't necessarily expect the deepest and most profound messages from him. So The Underground Railroad is about exactly what it sounds like. And by that, I mean it's even more about what it sounds like than you think it is. Rather than simply giving us historical fiction about escaped slaves traveling on the well-known network of abolitionists and allies called the Underground Railroad, Whitehead takes it one step further and makes this an actual railroad, with trains and stuff. To which I unfortunately have to ask the question, why? You see, it could be a very interesting premise, but it's never explored deeply enough to actually become really interesting, like it would be in a science fiction novel or something like that. It remains at the level of a useful plot transition device, one that often feels more for convenience than because it's actually interesting. For example, you just arrived in a town that's full of ardent racists and lynch mobs. Bummer, the train station's now closed, except for that train that you arrived on, so I guess you're stuck here indefinitely now. And I realized that traveling on the actual Underground Railroad likely carried many similar complications, and that the operation of literal stations here can serve as a metaphor for those challenges, but it doesn't really feel like a necessary metaphor. Why couldn't we have just actually heard about those challenges, learned the real lesson why slaves might be forced to spend a year secretly living in a town of people that absolutely despise all black people? And instead, repeatedly during this book, we can't even tell whether the situation that's occurring was an actual situation that slaves might have faced, or if Whitehead is kind of just using his imagination to allow his protagonist Cora to glimpse other societies of the antebellum South. Now, there are a few benefits to using a real railroad beyond just using it as a gimmick. First of all, it indicates clearly that Whitehead intends to deviate from an entirely realistic historical picture and instead to explore aspects of the historical picture along with more inventive, creative elements. Some have called it a speculative fiction rather than historical fiction for this reason. I'd argue, though, that in addition to just feeling a bit lazy at times because he doesn't have to actually stay true to real events, it also makes the story feel confusing, because we're supposed to interpret the events of the book through the lens of history, yet unless you've done quite a bit of reading about this time period, which we can assume that most readers won't, given how popular of a book this was, you'll have trouble deciphering which aspects of this novel were true to history and which ones were made up. Now, maybe that's not such a bad thing since it encourages readers to do our own research, but I also think it tends to confuse us and ultimately means we can only be certain of the historical grounding of events if we already knew about them in the first place. For example, Whitehead himself has said that the events that occur in different states of the book, U.S. states, have almost no basis in the actual regional attitudes towards slavery in each of these states, which is a bit bothersome to me because although I eventually figured this out, it took me a while, and I'd venture to say that a lot of people are going to read this book and not watch a bunch of interviews with the author and read a bunch of reviews to figure this out, and they'll just walk away thinking that on the surface, South Carolina was relatively tolerant to escaped slaves, even though it kind of exploited them in other ways, whereas North Carolina was incredibly dangerous, which this is all made up. The states in the book just as far as I can tell, simply don't represent the geographical history of the American South or North. Another related benefit to using actual trains is that by establishing the story as a sort of quasi-science fiction novel, Whitehead no longer has to strictly adhere to the constraints of time. The societies and events that Cora experiences aren't necessarily things that happen directly one after another, but may involve a fair amount of jumping around forward and maybe even backwards sometimes in historical time. Again, though, this is probably more confusing than it's worth, though it does give Whitehead the liberty to explore a lot of based on a true story events that he wouldn't have been able to do if he anchored his narrative purely within a traditional timeline. Some have criticized Whitehead's dialogue in the Underground Railroad for being too cold or emotionless, and although I can somewhat see how this makes his characters feel just a little bit less like actual people and more like symbols, it wasn't something I really noticed myself in any negative way while reading. I mean, for me, the relatively detached emotional style makes sense with the rest of Whitehead's style, and his personality in general, at least from what I've gathered watching a few interviews with Whitehead. What to some people might feel cold or even callous comes across for Whitehead a bit more as just his way of processing things. And I often appreciated it here because by choosing not to go on and on about how awful each particular awful event in the story is, it conveys a certain respect for the readers. It states that he's not going to convince you that slavery was rough or that there was a lot of violence involved. He trusts that you've gotten to that point before you even picked up this book, and instead he brings you into the stuff that he finds more interesting. Of course, I feel like where he goes wrong is he then does fall into this trap of over-explaining, and he begins to kind of start holding our hands while he's discussing the things that he finds more interesting, which I and some other reviewers I read or watched found detracted from the novel's overall impact. It wasn't unforgivable, but for example, when Cora, the main character, an escaped slave, witnesses troubling historical events such as the exploitation of black folks in a human zoo or as unwitting victims of medical experimentation, she really stretches any suspension of disbelief we might have with the level of critical intellectual development she demonstrates and just the overall awareness she has about what's going on. Now, I'm not saying that Cora as a slave escaped less than 1 year ago from a plantation couldn't eventually develop deeper ideas and opinions about what's going on, but I would mostly expect her here at this point in the first state she's been to simply be observing and reporting and leaving it to the reader to figure out what's going on. Instead, she seems unbelievably aware in a way that makes her feel no longer like a character in her own right, but rather a mouthpiece for the author to explain to us that having human zoos is not cool. Which, really, does it help to hear Cora say this in the first place? Or could we simply have just seen Cora's experience herself in a human zoo and drawn our own conclusions from observing what happened there? Similarly, some of the ideas she expresses later, like that there might be parallels between the institution of slavery and the displacement of Native Americans, or even also parallels with the plight of Irish immigrants who struggled to fit in at the time. These are certainly interesting points to consider through a modern lens, but I can hardly imagine that anyone 200 years ago would have considered them with such moral clarity and conviction, particularly not a woman who just escaped the plantation 1 or 2 years ago. I guess maybe the most charitable interpretation that I can give Whitehead is that he actually is envisioning himself as Cora, and that he really is the main character in the book, exploring these ideas of history through a sort of character who's not really meant to be her own character, but is more of a personification of himself. Not everyone will particularly like that interpretation. I myself would have preferred to have Cora just be like an actual character, but if we interpret it this way, it might at least justify what Whitehead is doing a little bit more. Adding to that oversimplification that I talked about, you'll be pretty hard-pressed to find any side characters with really any shades of moral ambiguity. Even those who initially seem sort of complex will be ones who are pretty easy by the end of the story to throw into the bin of a good person or a bad person, without really even having to give any caveats to that. For the most prominent example, though definitely not the only one, I just simply disbelieve, for example, that slave catchers were basically the incarnation of the devil, evil to the core, which is pretty much the characterization that we see in the slave catcher Ridgway, who's painted as such a villain. That's not to say that it's as simple in this book as the white people are the bad guys and the black people are the good guys, but it is as simple as all the white people ultimately come down as good guys or bad guys, not both. And all the black characters also come down as good or bad guys in the end. I'm not going to mention any specific names of characters here because I just prefer to keep this review spoiler-free, but in my Goodreads review that I wrote immediately after reading the book. I mentioned a few other characters that for me had the potential to be interesting, but then kind of just fell flat as they did some things that made it easy in the end for us to toss them into the bad guy bin. And I get that this story isn't about the white people or the side characters or everyone like that, but if that's the case, then we shouldn't be getting these occasional little excerpts from the point of view of these characters, which we do, that attempts to paint them more deeply. We should only be getting those if the author is really going to dig deep and make readers think about why someone would hold certain beliefs, or why they would do certain things that make life difficult for our protagonist and for other African Americans at the time. Things that seem incredibly cruel within the context of our main character's story. For me, this is kind of a missed opportunity because it means that as readers, we can comfortably align ourselves with the good guys and then sit back and watch them fight against the bad guys. We're not really challenged at all to see ourselves in the bad guys or to question where we might have fallen on more of this gray moral spectrum. And it's why ultimately, although I could say that this is a book that entertained me, it's not a book that particularly challenged me or made me think all that much. I wouldn't say I learned all that much from it or was even able to place myself fully within the perspective of any of the characters, the good guys or the bad guys, aside from these occasional glimpses. That's my 2 cents of the story, though. Basically, I certainly wouldn't discourage you from reading it if you were thinking about it, because I did kind of enjoy it, but I also wouldn't rush out to make it the next thing that you read. And although I unfortunately don't have any particular alternative recommendations for learning about this period, I think you could probably do somewhat better if looking for a book on this topic, and I'm sure there are lists of books that are good stories about the Underground Railroad. I also would recommend, though, given the enormous popularity of this book, checking out some of the other YouTube reviews out there, of which there are many, and some of them are quite positive, and some of them are more lukewarm, like my own. If you have read this book, let me know what you thought, and if you think there are any important dimensions of the book that I missed. And especially if you've read anything else about the Underground Railroad or the antebellum period that you enjoyed and would recommend. But other than that, until next time, bye and happy reading.